The morning sun rose over the farmland, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. Dew clung to the tall grass, and the sound of birds echoed across the wide open fields. For Paul, this was the most important week of the year. It was harvest time. He had been preparing for months, checking every machine, sharpening every blade, and making sure his workers were ready. The land stretched far and wide, and every acre was full of crops waiting to be collected. Paul walked out toward the field, expecting to see his tractor parked at the usual spot near the barn. That old green machine had been with him for years. It was not shiny or new, but it was strong and dependable. He trusted it the way a fisherman trusts his boat. But when he reached the barn, something was wrong. The space was empty. Only fresh tire marks pressed into the dirt told him the tractor had been moved. For a moment, Paul thought maybe one of the workers had driven it to the far side of the land. He shaded his eyes with his hand, scanning the fields, but there was no tractor in sight. His stomach sank. He hurried toward the road that separated his farmland from the neat neighborhood across the fence. That was when he saw her. Karen, the head of the local homeowners association, stood near the entrance, holding a clipboard like it was a crown. She was dressed in neat clothes that looked out of place on farmland: clean white shoes, pressed trousers, and a shirt without a single wrinkle. Her face carried that same proud smile she always wore when she thought she had won something. "Good morning, Paul," she said in a voice that was sharp and clear. "If you are looking for that tractor, you will not find it here. I had it towed early this morning." Paul stopped in his tracks. "You did what?" he asked calmly, though his heart was pounding. Karen adjusted her glasses and tapped her clipboard. The tractor was parked too close to the neighborhood boundary. It was an eyesore, and it violated the rules. "I warned you before about keeping heavy machinery near the houses. We have standards here. People pay good money to live in a clean, well-kept area." That rusty thing was lowering the look of the place. Paul stared at her, his hands resting on his hips. "Karen, that tractor is not just a piece of metal sitting there. It is the only machine I have ready for the harvest. The fields are full, and every hour matters. You had no right to touch it." "Oh, I had every right," Karen replied quickly. The HOA board approved the action, and the tow truck came at dawn. "If you want it back, you can pay the impound fee. That is how the rules work. Until then, your harvest will just have to wait." Paul did not raise his voice. He did not argue or step closer. Instead, he looked out across the golden fields, where the crops sway gently in the breeze. A small smile touched his lips, not one of joy but one of understanding. Karen thought she had made a strong move, but she had no idea of the bigger picture. "You should be careful, Karen," Paul said softly. "Sometimes rules are smaller than the land they try to control." Karen frowned, not liking the tone of his words. "I do not know what you mean. Rules are rules. Everyone must follow them." Paul nodded, as if agreeing, though in his heart he carried a truth that Karen had never bothered to learn. He did not own just a small patch of land by the neighborhood. He leased the entire farmland to the state. Every acre, every crop, and every grain that grew there was part of a contract bigger than Karen could imagine. Her decision to tow away one tractor was not just an inconvenience. It was a mistake that would soon reach beyond her clipboard and her neighborhood. As Karen turned and walked back toward her row of identical houses, Paul stood quietly by the road. The harvest still needed to be done, and the tractor was gone, but Paul was not worried. The land was not only his duty, it was part of something larger, and the state itself depended on it. He knew that soon enough, Karen and her board would learn what it meant to interfere with farmland that fed thousands. The sun climbed higher, shining over the golden fields. Paul took a deep breath and began planning his next move. The harvest would not wait, and neither would he. The next morning, Paul was up before the sun. He walked across the wide fields, his boots crunching the dry soil, and looked at the crops that waited to be gathered. Without the tractor, the harvest would be delayed. Every delay meant risk. The crops could spoil, the weather could turn, and the state would be asking questions. He knew he could not waste time arguing with Karen. She believed her clipboard gave her power, but Paul held something stronger. Years ago, he had signed a contract with the state, leasing the entire farmland for agricultural supply. This meant the crops from his fields were not just for him. They were part of the state's food supply. He was responsible for meeting deadlines, and the state always made sure nothing stood in the way of harvest. Paul entered his small farmhouse office, pulled out a worn folder, and carefully reviewed the papers. The contract was clear. The land, though farmed by him, was under state protection. No private group, not even an HOA, could interfere with operations. He picked up the phone and dialed the number listed on the contract. Within an hour, a state officer named Mark arrived in a clean truck. He was a tall man with a serious face, dressed in plain uniform clothes. Stepping out of the truck, he shook Paul's hand firmly. "Morning, Paul. I got your call. You said there was interference with your equipment." Paul nodded. "Yes. The head of the HOA had my tractor towed yesterday. She claims it was parked too close to their neighborhood boundary." Mark frowned. "During harvest week? That is unacceptable. The state relies on this farmland. I will file a notice right away." Together, they walked along the boundary where the farmland met the neat houses. Karen was already outside, trimming her flowers and pretending not to notice them. But when she heard footsteps, she turned, her smile tight. "Well, if it isn't Paul and a guest," she said in a sharp voice. "I hope you are here to admit that the tractor was parked in violation of the rules." Mark pulled out a badge and held it where she could see. "Good morning, ma'am. My name is Mark, State Agriculture Officer. I am here on official duty. I understand you had a piece of farming equipment towed from this land." Karen blinked, caught off guard. She cleared her throat. "Yes, that is correct. It was unsightly and against the community standards. We cannot allow rusty machines so close to the homes. The neighborhood has rules, and everyone must respect them." Mark's expression did not change. "This farmland is under state lease. The crops grown here are part of the state's supply program. That tractor is essential to operations. By interfering, you have violated state protection laws. This is not about neighborhood rules. This is about food supply, and the law does not allow anyone to obstruct it." Karen's face turned pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it, searching for words. "I was only doing my duty for the community," she finally said. "Your duty," Mark replied firmly, "does not give you authority over farmland contracted to the state. I will be filing an official notice. You and your board may face fines if this continues. I suggest you release the tractor immediately." Paul stood silently beside him, his arms crossed. He watched Karen's confidence shrink. She had always acted like the farmland was just another backyard to control, but now she was learning the land answered to a higher authority. Karen tried to smile again, though it was weaker than before. Perhaps we can discuss this more politely. There must be a way to respect both sides. The way to respect both sides, Mark said, is to stay within your boundary. The farmland is not under your control. Do not interfere again. With that, he handed her a copy of the notice and turned back toward his truck. Paul followed, glancing once more at Karen, who now stood frozen on her perfect lawn, gripping her clipboard as if it might save her. Back at the farmhouse, Mark promised to speed up the process of returning the tractor. It should not take long, he said. We will handle the paperwork, and the towing company will have no choice but to release it. Paul thanked him and shook his hand. The officer drove away, leaving Paul standing in the warm morning light. The crops swayed gently in the wind, waiting for the machine that would soon return. Paul knew the harvest would continue, but he also knew Karen would not give up easily. She had tasted power once, and she would try again. Still, he was ready. The land was not just his livelihood. It was protected by the state itself. And that meant Karen's clipboard would never be enough to stop him. Karen could not sleep that night. She paced across her living room, the clipboard resting on her coffee table like a shield she had failed to use. The words of the state officer echoed in her head. The farmland is not under your control. She hated how Paul had stood there so calmly, watching her crumble. She had built her reputation in the neighborhood by being strict, by making sure every house had trimmed lawns, painted fences, and clean sidewalks. People respected her authority, or at least pretended to, because they feared her letters and fines. But now, in front of Paul and a state officer, she had been made to look powerless. That was something Karen could not accept. The next morning, she gathered the HOA board in her backyard. 4 members sat around a neat wooden table, sipping tea as Karen explained her frustration. That tractor was more than just a machine, Karen said, her hands moving sharply as she spoke. It was a challenge to our rules. If we allow one farmer to place ugly equipment near our homes, soon there will be more. Our property values will drop, and our neighborhood will lose its charm. One board member, a man named Henry, shifted uncomfortably. But Karen, the state officer said, the farmland is not under our control. If we keep pushing, we might end up in legal trouble. Karen narrowed her eyes. Do you want to live beside rusty tractors and noisy machines? Do you want your children playing near fields filled with dust and workers? No, Henry. This is about protecting our way of life. Another member, Lisa, spoke softly. What if we find another way? Something that does not break the law but still puts pressure on Paul. Karen leaned forward. Go on. Lisa tapped her fingers on the table. We could file complaints about noise, traffic, or even dust from the fields. If we gather enough signatures from the residents, the city might force him to change how he operates. The state may control the land, but the city can still look at environmental concerns. Karen's eyes lit up. It was not the bold strike she wanted, but it was clever. Yes. That could work. If we cannot control the land directly, we can make life so difficult for him that he has no choice but to bend. The board members nodded slowly, though Henry still looked nervous. But Karen ignored his hesitation. She already felt stronger with this new plan forming in her head. Later that day, she went door to door in the neighborhood. Her clipboard returned to her hand like a weapon. She spoke to each family about protecting the community and keeping the neighborhood safe from farming problems. She painted pictures of dust clouds, loud machines, and busy trucks blocking the streets. One by one, people signed her papers, some because they agreed, and others because they did not want to argue with her. By evening, Karen had a thick stack of signatures. She smiled proudly, certain this time she had found a way to challenge Paul without crossing the state. Meanwhile, Paul worked in his fields, using smaller equipment and extra workers while waiting for the tractor's return. He noticed Karen walking around with her clipboard but paid little attention. He knew her type. People like her loved control, and they would not stop easily. Still, he trusted that the truth was stronger than any of her tricks. That night, as Paul sat on his porch, one of his workers came running up with news. "Paul," the worker said, "Karen is collecting complaints. She says the farm makes too much noise and causes dust. She is telling people to sign her petition." Paul listened quietly, nodding. "I expected as much. She cannot touch the land, so she will try the air above it. But the crops do not grow without machines, and harvest cannot wait." He looked out across the wide fields glowing silver under the moonlight. He knew Karen's new plan might bring inspectors or city officers to the farmland. But he also knew the contract with the state was strong. The land was protected, and no pile of signatures could erase that. Still, Paul felt the weight of coming trouble. Karen had drawn her line again, and soon, the battle between the farmland and the neighborhood would grow sharper. For now, he leaned back on his chair, listening to the soft sound of the night breeze in the crops. The land had faced storms before, and it would face this one 2.2 days later. Paul was in the fields early, directing his workers as they cut and loaded crops by hand. The missing tractor still slowed them down, but the work had to continue. Sweat rolled down his forehead, and his shirt clung to his back as the sun climbed higher. He paused to drink water from a tin bottle when he noticed two cars pulling up near the boundary. Out stepped three people in neat clothes, holding clipboards and cameras. One wore a city badge clipped to his pocket. The other two looked like assistants, ready to write down every detail. Paul knew right away what this was. Karen had moved forward with her plan. The man with the badge approached. "Good morning. My name is Daniel, city inspector. We've received several complaints about dust, noise, and traffic from this farmland. We're here to look into it." Paul nodded politely. "Morning, Daniel. You're welcome to look. This land is under lease to the state, but I will answer any questions you have." Karen appeared moments later, walking quickly down the street, her clipboard pressed proudly against her chest. She had timed her arrival perfectly. "Inspector," she said, almost breathless, "thank you for coming. As you can see, this farm creates constant noise and dust. The residents have been suffering for weeks." Daniel looked at her, then back at Paul. "We'll take a closer look." The inspectors walked into the field, stepping carefully around the plants. They took pictures of workers carrying baskets, of small trucks loading near the edge of the land, and of the dry soil where the wind sometimes lifted a faint cloud of dust. Karen followed closely, pointing at everything. "Do you see the dust rising? Imagine breathing that in every day. And listen to those engines. The community was promised peace, but this is far from it. Children cannot play outside. Windows stay shut. Property values are dropping." Paul stayed calm. He had nothing to hide. "Inspector," he said evenly, "this is harvest season. The dust is natural, the noise is necessary, and the traffic is limited to small trucks that carry the crops. Without this work, the harvest will fail. And if it fails, the state will feel it." Daniel wrote notes on his pad, his face neutral. We understand your position, but complaints from the neighborhood must be recorded. We'll prepare a report for the city. It's possible further action will be considered." Karen's smile widened as she stood a little taller. She imagined the report would end Paul's stubborn calm. But Paul did not flinch. He simply nodded. "Do what you must. The farmland is protected by state contract. If the city has questions, they should speak with the state agriculture office. I have all the documents ready." The inspectors spent another hour walking through the fields, writing notes, and snapping photos. Paul led them to his office and showed them the folder of contracts, stamped and signed by the state. Daniel looked through the papers carefully. His assistants whispered to each other, pointing at official seals. Finally, Daniel closed the folder and stood. "Thank you, Paul. We'll file our report, but I see that the land is not just private property. It is tied to the state. That changes how complaints are handled." Karen stepped forward quickly. "But surely the city has some power. We cannot live like this, surrounded by dust and tractors." Daniel's voice stayed calm. "We will review the complaints, but as of now, nothing here breaks city code. Farming creates dust, noise, and traffic. That is the nature of it. Unless we see clear violations, there is little more to say." Karen's face tightened. She had expected the inspectors to take her side. Instead, they sounded neutral, even slightly leaning toward Paul. She opened her mouth to argue again, but Daniel raised his hand. "Ma'am, we've noted your concerns. We'll file them, but this farmland is under state oversight. If you want further action, you'll need to speak directly with the state." Karen's shoulders stiffened, her eyes flashing with frustration. The inspectors packed up their things and walked back to their cars. Paul escorted them politely, shaking Daniel's hand before they left. When the cars drove away, silence fell over the boundary. Paul returned to his work, his step steady, his face calm. Karen stood frozen for a moment, then turned sharply and stormed back toward her neighborhood. She had failed again, but her pride would not let her stop. Paul, watching from the field, knew this was not the end. Karen's determination was strong, but so was the law that protected his land. The harvest would continue, and every challenge only made him more certain that the truth was on his side. The day after the city inspectors left, Karen woke early with a restless energy. She had expected her plan to intimidate Paul to work, but the inspections had proved that the farmland was protected. The state had authority, and city officials would not interfere without cause. Karen paced the floors of her living room, clutching her clipboard. She could not let this go. Her reputation as the HOA leader was on the line. If the neighbors thought she was powerless, they might stop following her rules altogether. She needed a new plan, and she needed one that would make Paul feel pressure without breaking the law. By mid-morning, Karen called a neighborhood meeting. Families gathered in the small community hall, curious but also somewhat wary. Karen stood at the front, her clipboard in hand, and spoke passionately. "Friends," she began, "we have tried to address the problems politely. Dust, noise, and trucks have disrupted our lives. The city inspected, but they cannot solve everything. The farmland still operates near our homes. We must act together." Some neighbors whispered among themselves. Many remembered the tractors and dust, and some were ready to support her. Karen continued, "We will organize a petition, asking for clear schedules for work, limitations on trucks, and dust control measures. We are not stopping the farm. We are asking for fairness. A few neighbors raised hands. "Will this really work?" asked Mrs. Patel, an older woman with glasses. Karen smiled confidently. "Yes. Paul must see that the community will not be ignored. The more signatures we collect, the stronger our voice. If he refuses to listen, we can take it to the city again. But this time, he will feel the pressure from all of us." Meanwhile, Paul continued his work in the fields. His tractor had been returned, but delays meant every hour mattered. Workers moved quickly, cutting, collecting, and stacking crops. Paul noticed Karen's group walking along the edge of the farmland with clipboards in hand. He walked toward them calmly. "Good morning, everyone," Paul said politely, keeping his voice steady. "I see you are busy." Karen stepped forward, her tone firm. "Paul, the neighborhood is tired of the dust and noise. We are asking for schedules, for your machines to move at certain hours, and for dust control measures. We want to work together peacefully." Paul nodded. "I understand your concerns. Harvest is a busy time, and the land requires careful attention. I am happy to discuss schedules. But please remember, this farmland is under state lease. The crops must reach the state on time. Delays could affect thousands." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. "We are not asking to stop the work completely. We only want limits so our homes are not disturbed." Paul smiled calmly. "Then let us agree. My team can adjust work times to reduce traffic near the homes in the early morning and late evening. Dust is harder to control, but I will make sure water trucks dampen the fields where possible to minimize it." Karen hesitated, unsure if this was a concession or a defeat. She did not like being told she could not control the farmland, yet the neighbors were watching. They needed reassurance that she was acting. She nodded slowly. Over the next few days, Karen's group collected signatures, and Paul adjusted work schedules where feasible. The fields continued to thrive, the crops slowly filling baskets and trucks. Both sides learned the value of patience and compromise. Karen stayed active, walking along the boundary each morning, clipboard in hand. Paul continued to lead his team, calm and focused. Both understood the tension would not disappear completely, but for now, the harvest moved forward, and the crops were safe. That night, Paul stood on the porch, looking at the glowing fields. The tractor hummed quietly in the distance, ready for another day. He knew Karen would continue her efforts, but the state lease, his preparation, and his patience made him confident. The land was protected, and the harvest would succeed. And as the moon rose over the golden fields, both Paul and Karen understood that the coming days would test their resolve, but neither could ignore the power of the land itself. The sun rose early over the farmland, spilling golden light across the ripening crops. Paul moved among the fields, checking each row carefully. The harvest was in full swing, and time was critical. Any delay could affect the quality of the produce and the schedule he had promised the state. The tractor rumbled steadily across the field, carrying heavy loads to the storage area. Paul watched the workers coordinate efficiently, passing baskets and crates with precision. Everything seemed under control, yet a quiet tension hung in the air. From the edge of the farmland, Karen watched, her clipboard tucked under her arm. She had not stopped monitoring the situation. Each truck, each sound of the tractor, and each movement in the field made her pulse quicken. Her neighborhood had signed her petition, and she felt a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. She had proven the community cared, but Paul remained calm and in control. Karen decided to approach the boundary. "Paul," she called, her voice carrying over the field. Paul looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Good morning, Karen," he replied evenly. "Everything going well?" Karen folded her arms. "I want to make sure the harvest does not disturb the neighborhood. Are you following the schedule we agreed on?" Paul smiled politely. "We are following it closely. Early mornings and late evenings are quiet. We are also using water to reduce dust where possible. The crops need attention, but I am making sure the community is respected." Karen's frown deepened. "I will be watching. If these conditions are not followed, we will report again." "This is serious." Paul nodded. "I understand. Please remember, the state relies on this harvest. Delays can affect many people. I am doing everything possible to meet both needs." As the day went on, the workers moved efficiently, but clouds began to gather in the distance. The sky darkened, and a strong wind began to blow. Paul's heart sank. If a storm hit before the harvest was complete, the crops could be ruined. He gathered the workers quickly. "We need to secure the field," he said. "Load the remaining crops into storage and protect the delicate produce. Move fast, but carefully." Karen, standing at the boundary, watched the movement. She realized that nature, not the law, might pose the greatest challenge. She could see Paul's leadership as he directed every action calmly, even under pressure. Hours passed. The wind picked up, rustling the crops violently. Clouds covered the sun, casting shadows across the farmland. Paul and his team worked tirelessly, coordinating tractors, workers, and carts. Every second counted. Karen's heart raced. She could see the danger, yet she felt powerless. No matter how many petitions she had collected or complaints she filed, she could not stop a storm. She watched as Paul moved from worker to worker, his voice steady, giving instructions that made sense even in chaos. Finally, just as the first raindrops began to fall, the last batch of crops was safely in storage. Paul stood in the field, exhausted but satisfied. The storm hit fully, with wind and rain lashing the open fields, but the critical produce was safe. Karen lowered her clipboard. She realized something important. Paul's calm, his preparation, and his connection to the land allowed him to manage situations far beyond her control. The tractor, the workers, the schedule, they were all tools, but his knowledge of the land was the real power. When the storm finally passed, Paul walked to the boundary. "Karen," he said gently, "the harvest is protected, and the crops are safe. Nature can be unpredictable, but preparation makes all the difference." Karen nodded slowly. She could see that her efforts, though well-intentioned, had limits. The farmland, the state contract, and Paul's leadership were stronger than petitions or complaints. That evening, as the sun returned, Paul stood on his porch, looking over the field. The golden crops glistened with rain, ready for the next stage. He knew the final part of the harvest would be challenging, but he felt confident. Karen's attempts to interfere were slowing, but the land itself had taught another lesson: strength comes from preparation, patience, and respect for what cannot be controlled. For now, the harvest continued. The land had survived the storm, and Paul's calm leadership ensured it would thrive to the very end. The morning sun rose over the farmland, bright and warm, promising a calm day after the storm. Paul stepped onto the porch, stretching and taking in the view. The crops, glistening with rain, looked healthier than ever. The workers were already moving through the fields, finishing the final stages of harvest with quiet efficiency. Paul felt a sense of relief. The storm had tested them, but every crate, every basket, had survived. His tractor hummed steadily, moving across the land with ease, and the workers worked in perfect rhythm. The state's deadline was approaching, but he was confident the harvest would meet it. From the edge of the farmland, Karen watched again, her clipboard in hand. She had hoped to find a reason to challenge Paul, but the fields looked orderly, the crops safe, and the workers busy. Her neighbors stood nearby, watching the progress quietly. Some looked impressed by the scale of the harvest, others uncertain about their complaints. Karen stepped closer to the boundary. "Paul," she called, her voice firmer than usual, "the neighborhood still has concerns. But I can see that the work is moving well. Are you sure nothing will go wrong?" Paul smiled gently. "Karen, the harvest has always been our priority. We have prepared, adapted, and protected the crops. Nature tried to challenge us, but preparation and teamwork kept everything safe." Karen looked at him, noticing his calm confidence. She realized that no amount of complaints, petitions, or inspections could replace knowledge and care for the land. Paul's connection to the farmland, his leadership, and his respect for the state contract made him capable of handling challenges that she could never control. She took a deep breath. "I suppose. I see now. The crops are safe, and the work is well done. Maybe I underestimated the effort needed." Paul nodded. "It is not about underestimating. The land requires respect and understanding. Everyone can have concerns, and I try to accommodate them, but the work must continue. The state depends on this harvest, and so do many families." Karen paused, then slowly lowered her clipboard. "I understand. Perhaps, we can find ways to cooperate rather than fight. The neighborhood and the farmland must exist side by side." Paul smiled. "That is all I ask. Communication and respect go a long way. The harvest is complete, and everything is safe. That is a good outcome for all of us." As the day went on, the last of the crops were gathered. The workers loaded the produce onto trucks, ready to deliver to the state. The tractor moved steadily, carrying heavy loads, its engine a steady rhythm across the golden field. Paul supervised quietly, proud of the work completed, but careful not to overlook any details. Karen watched from her position near the boundary, the clipboard now unused at her side. She realized that the farmland was larger than her rules, stronger than her complaints, and governed by forces she could not control. Still, she understood the value of compromise. She had learned a lesson about limits and respect. By evening, the fields were empty of crops, the baskets stacked neatly, and the tractors resting by the barn. Paul walked along the rows, inspecting the land one final time. Everything was in order. The harvest was complete. Karen approached, a small smile on her face. "Paul," she said, I appreciate your effort. The harvest was challenging, and you handled it well. Perhaps we can work together in the future, with understanding on both sides." Paul nodded, extending a hand. "I would like that, Karen. The land benefits when we work together. Respecting each other and the work is the key." Karen shook his hand. "Agreed. Let's try to keep the neighborhood and farmland in balance." The sun set behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. Paul stood on the porch, looking at the golden stubble left behind by the harvested crops. The tractor rested quietly, the workers had left for the day, and the storm's threat was a memory. In that quiet moment, Paul felt a sense of completion. The harvest had tested him, challenged him, and proven his dedication. Karen had learned respect, the neighborhood had seen the effort involved, and the state's contract had ensured the farmland's protection. The farmland was calm again, the work finished, and the balance restored. Paul took a deep breath, watching the stars appear in the night sky. The harvest was complete, and peace returned to the fields at last.